Thank you very much for joining us for today's event. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that we're all on the traditional lands of First Nations people, and this land was never ceded. In chairing this panel discussion today, I'm currently speaking to you from the Faculty of Law in beautiful Building 2 on the city campus. And I want to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation upon whose ancestral land the city campus sits. As a member of an educational institution, I'd also like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the original custodians of the knowledge of this land. As a lawyer, I'm very aware of the role of law in the role of law in the original act of disposition and the harms that have taken place since. At the same time, it's important to recognise that law has a key role to play in the work that still needs to be done to repair past harms and indeed those that are still ongoing. I'm very grateful to work in a law school where colleagues are engaged in this work. And as we turn to the focus for today's discussion, I think it's also important to reflect on the fact that inequalities in global systems, in international political and economic relations, and the unequal causes and effects of climate change have their origins in the global colonial practices of which the colonisation of Australia was a part. Now, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Michael Thomson, and I'm a Professor of Health Law and Director of Law Health Justice, where we've co-organised today's event. It's a genuine pleasure to be joined by Sharon Friel, who is a Professor of Health Equity at the Australian National University, and two of my UTS colleagues, Elna Tulus and Jason Pryor. And I'll introduce each of these in turn in just a moment. But of course, first, we have some housekeeping. So today's event is, of course, being live captioned. To view the captions, click on the CC button that you'll see in the control panel at the bottom of your screen. Or you can click on the link that's now in the chat. If you have questions during today's event, and I'm sure there will be many, please type them into the Q&A box, which you'll also find in the Zoom panel at the bottom of your screen. You can upvote questions others have asked, which I think is a really handy way of doing this. Please do try and keep your questions relevant to the focus of today's discussion. Also, please try and keep them brief. That will make my job much easier. So now on to today's discussion. The planet is facing multiple crises. 2023 was the hottest year since records began in 1880. 10 of the hottest years that the planet has experienced have taken place since 2010. Periods of drought have been followed quickly by periods of flooding, and in New South Wales, we obviously know this well. Last year, wildfires swept across continents simultaneously, and we're now living with record levels of food insecurity, escalating biodiversity loss, and a widening gap between rich and poor, and that's between countries and within countries. So how do we understand and respond to these alarming trends? We increasingly understand how human health is reliant on planetary health. Human health and thriving communities depend on planetary health, flourishing natural systems, and the wise stewardship of natural resources. I'm really looking forward to our panel discussion, and I'd like to start by introducing Sharon, who will give a short keynote to kick off our discussion today. Sharon is an Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow, Professor of Health Equity and Director of the Planetary Health Equity Hothouse at the Australian National University. Her work focuses on the governance of planetary, social and commercial determinants of health inequities. She's a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences of Australia and the Academy of Health and Medical Sciences of Australia. I'm sure many of you will know Sharon from the significant contributions that she's made to our understanding of the global social injustice of health inequalities. Welcome, Sharon, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Michael. Yeah, really lovely to be here. I'm joining you from the lands of the Ngunnawal people. I'm in Canberra. As you'd said, Michael, the unceded lands of First Nations peoples, and so just to pay my respects to elders past and present. So my task is to just sort of give some preliminary remarks, sort of provocations around these sorts of issues. And I've broken it up into kind of 3 pieces. The first is that connection. So with all of those, with the climate change that we are experiencing that Michael has just referred to, what does that mean in terms of social inequalities? And what does that mean for health, people's health and health inequities? And we speak about this as planetary health equity, the equitable enjoyment of good health in a stable Earth system. And all of that, of course, is at risk. I would say we have a planetary health equity crisis right now. So how does climate change affect our health? And there's lots of different ways that happens. Temperatures are going up. With that, we're experiencing more heat stress, more heat exhaustion, heat stroke. All of this is also related to cardiovascular diseases, to kidney diseases. So I should have prefaced my remarks with saying the front end is just, it's all the facts of despair. We will get to hope shortly, but let me start with the facts of despair. But climate change also affects our health in another way, sort of through air pollution as well. So dirtier air, ozone interactions, dirtier air linked to much higher hospital admission rates for people who are asthmatic, people who suffer from cardiac or pulmonary diseases. So those sorts of health relationships. In a slightly broader sense, as the land and the sea undergoes all sorts of rapid changes associated with climate change, the animals that live on and in the land and the sea are going to disappear if they don't adapt, and if they don't adapt quickly enough. And so for things like the pollinators, the bees, if they disappear, then that, of course, has massive implications for food security, for example. So that's another way that climate change is interacting and affecting our health. We've seen already the very acute and chronic impacts on mental health from climate change. So both the experience of climate change events and then the anxiety about future climate change and the associated events has very immediate impacts on our mental well-being, but that accumulation over time, we know and we're seeing in the data having impacts for chronic mental ill health as well. And so these sorts of pathways through to different health outcomes everybody is experiencing it. I don't believe that nobody is affected by all of this, but it's happening very unequally. So people and nations who are poorer, the elderly, people living with particular disabilities, people who experience social marginalisation on a sort of ongoing basis, the data shows us that these are the communities, the populations who are least able to adapt to the changing climate. They're the populations who are unable to escape the floods, the fires, the heat. They're the populations who are most likely to live in dwellings and environments that amplify those heat or flooding events. And so really what we're seeing is climate change exacerbating the existing social and health inequities, really exacerbating that. And I give the example of Lismore. So in 2022, 82% of the population living in the flood area with Lismore were in the most socially disadvantaged neighbourhoods. In 2017, the Northern Rivers floods, which included Lismore, it was the same communities that experienced. So in 2017 and in 2022, it was the same communities. So there was nothing that had really changed for those communities in terms of their underlying social conditions. That was a failure of social policy to address the social, what we refer to in public health as the social determinants of health and health inequities. And then you get the added effects of climate change exacerbating those physical and mental health effects. So if we want to see a healthy and equitable future, we've got to address social inequities as well as addressing climate change. And I would argue that planetary health equity is a massive opportunity, a really massive opportunity. It's a massive opportunity for climate stabilisation, for social equity, and for good health outcomes. But it means we've got to think across sectors to do that. So addressing planetary health equity means mitigation of climate change. We were having a discussion just beforehand about, is it mitigation of the health impacts or climate change mitigation is, as far as I'm concerned, one of the biggest preventative health measures that exists. And if we want to mitigate further climate change, we've got to address the global consumptogenic system, as we refer to it in the hothouse. So what do I mean by the consumptogenic system? And these are the common drivers of climate change, of inequality, and of poor health. The consumptogenic system is this web of institutions, of policies, of commercial activities, of institutional and social norms and behaviours that bake in, that incentivize, that reward the excessive extraction, production, consumption of fossil fuel goods and services. Obviously incredibly harmful for the environment, and often very bad for human health, and certainly very unequally distributed. And I think there's three systems embedded, three kind of domains embedded within there that create real problems, but real opportunities. The economic system, the energy system, and the food system. And if we were to think about a recalibration within those three systems, because they contribute very significantly to driving emissions and other environmental harms, then we would go a long way to do something about planetary health inequities. So there's real possibilities to do that, and this, I hope, is coming to the slightly more hopeful side of things. There's the role of different actors, so this is the governance of the consumptogenic system, and the governance of that in a way that transforms or changes that system towards planetary health equity outcomes, not planetary health inequities. So the role of the state is fundamentally important. The state has to play a big role in all of this. Imagine public policy that optimizes the climate, the social, and the health outcomes. Imagine if we had a COP. So this is a plug for the Australian desire to play a leadership role in COP31 with Pacific countries across the Pacific region. Imagine those ministries, those state leaders saying the agenda for COP31 would be a strong focus on these social and health principles and goals, with a diversity of knowledges, and particularly First Nations knowledge, driving that agenda. That would be a marvellous leadership demonstration from the state, and particularly in Australia. We also have the opportunity of rethinking the economic system. So here in Australia, for example, we have the measuring what matters, the well-being economy discussion. Who knows whether that's going to really take off, but that in essence is a new policy idea, a new policy paradigm for economic policy. And one of the things we're doing in the hothouse is examining whether this well-being economy turn has purchase for redressing this consumptogenic system. So let's see. But of course, fundamentally, I think the big question of why this consumptogenic system exists, why it's not changed, is because of power and the power inequities that are absolutely entrenched in that consumptogenic system. Because of course, the interests, the commercial interests, the conservative elites do very well out of business as usual. You know, they do really well out of that consumptogenic system. They're working really hard to control the narrative, economic growth, economic profits for that. That's the goal, rather than, you know, the economy in service of people on the planet. They're setting the rules of the game. So the very fact that the economic system, the trade system, the investment system, the food system is basically ruled by the interests of the conservative elites and the corporations is really problematic from a planetary health equity perspective. And of course, what that is doing is it's underwriting the norms, the social and the political norms of what might be expected within society. But there is hope. We see a turn happening, I think, within terms of market activity. So the B Corps, for example, again, I'm not convinced that these new forms of sustainable business models are the be all and end all, but that it's an opportunity. We're seeing ethical investors starting to say, nope, we don't want investment in new climate change new fossil fuel projects. We need the big institutional investors to be saying exactly that. At the moment, it's still on the fringes, but that's happening. So that'll make a shift in the market arena. And then really importantly, and I'll finish with this, really importantly, is the importance of I call them the influencers, the strategic mobilization across civil society, across the public, pushing up, not pushing down to community, but pushing up, that says, you, the state, have absolute responsibility for looking after the public welfare and for protecting the environment. And you, the market, are here to serve not just your profit interests, but you have made promises through your environment, social governance indicators to actually look out for these other other principles. So civil society and the coalitions of networks really is vitally important. So I'll finish my remarks there, Michael, and hopefully that's just some kind of provocations for our wider panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Sharon, and thank you in particular for ending on a hopeful note in what can be quite a difficult conversation. And I look forward to exploring those issues in the discussion we will have in a moment. But first, I'd like to introduce our other panel members. Excuse me. Elna Tulus is a PhD candidate here in the Faculty of Health. Her research on the sustainability of the global food systems questions its consequences for public health. Using the case study of Australian wheat and Indonesian instant noodles, she investigates how the transformation of food production has resulted in a change in dietary patterns towards ultra-processed foods. And then these have resulted in a significant increase in non-communicable diseases. Welcome. Thank you for joining us, Elna.
Thank you, Michael.
Professor, I'll just introduce Jason and then we'll come back. Professor Jason Pryor is Professor of Planning, Health and the Environment in the UTS Institute for Sustainable Futures. He's recognized as an expert working across environment, planning, human and planetary health. Jason wears many hats, including lead of the Healthy Populations and Environments platform in the Sydney Partnership for Health, Education, Research and Enterprise. And he also convenes the Climate Change and Health Collaborative in Insight, the university's new exciting health institute. Welcome to you as well, Jason. So I've got questions. I've got the privilege of having questions for everyone before we open up the discussion more broadly to our audience. So I'm going to start with a question for you, Sharon. And thank you so much for your compelling account of the relationship between global systems, planetary health, and the impact on human health. And I really valued the attention that you paid to the inequalities of impacts and the ties that we clearly see to social inequalities there. And today the discussion is really focused on climate change, but I wanted to ask you a question that moves us slightly out of that, but allows us to look at these core drivers. So we increasingly hear not just of climate change, but of the triple environmental crisis. So we bring climate change together with loss of biodiversity and pervasive pollution. So can I just ask you, in terms of your analysis, are the drivers for each of these elements of the crisis the same?
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I mean, I think they're similar, that there obviously are probably some important points of difference. Most of my knowledge is in the climate change space, but if you think of, so some of that biodiversity loss and then that excessive pollution that you mentioned, with some of the biodiversity loss, a lot of that is like land clearing. Why is land clearing happening? It's partly due to like some of the big food corporations, partly for particular crop growing purposes. So you've kind of got a common element of some of those corporate practices there. Same with pollution. You've got the fossil fuels sitting behind as a core component of that pollution, whether the pollution comes through the production phase or whether it comes into the cars driving about. But so I do think there are some real common drivers across those areas. And one of the things I would love to see is, so there's movement happening. There's the biodiversity framework that's in play, global framework, and then we've got the climate change, through the UNFCCC. Wouldn't it be fantastic if those communities were talking much more closely to each other to address those common drivers? And then the same, I see a wee bit more of it into the pollution area. So I'm not anti-business, but some of the corporate practices, you'll observe them across those three issues.
Okay, thank you. So there's something in that sort of consumptogenic core that seems to be driving each of those elements.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Thank you. Elna, and I think this is something that maybe you'll pick up in some ways. In your research, you take this fascinating and ubiquitous case study, the instant noodle, and you use it to highlight how food production patterns can drive ill health and health inequities. And I wonder if you could tell us just a little bit more about your amazing research. And I'm particularly interested in the causes of the causes, to use a public health phrase. So what are the determinants of such changes in production patterns?
Thank you, Michael. The following on from what Sharon just mentioned about the biodiversity loss, the opening of land for food production, if we just look at instant noodles, the two key ingredients, palm oil and wheat, demonstrates just that. So the transformation of production over years has shifted how we consume. My research looks broadly into how historically, for example, wheat came to Australia in the first fleet, and it became an economic driver for the country. So by 1956, for example, Australia had become one of the 4 largest exporter of wheat in the world. And that had shifted, and that period is really important in the 1950s to 70s because it's during the Cold War. What happened was the invention of instant noodles, which came from Japan, became an opportunity for countries and companies to open up in areas such as Southeast Asia that had communist influence. And so US was donating wheat at the time using their public law 480. And the donation of wheat to Indonesia actually helped the production and the establishment of instant noodles. They actually opened up the world's biggest mill in Jakarta at the time in 1971. And so over time, the consumption, plus including food insecurity, because palm oil plantation had been introduced by Dutch colonizers back in the 1800s, the land wasn't available for people to grow food. And so all these palm oil plantations, you have people consuming instant noodles, and it was cheap, it's tasty. And Indonesia is now the second world's largest consumer of instant noodles. And it correlates regarding the non-communicable diseases, high stroke, diabetes, heart issues. And I'd like to come back to what Sharon mentioned earlier regarding the power that was entrenched. If we look at wheat exporting countries, the 8 largest wheat exporting countries basically cover over 75% of the value of wheat around the world. So countries like Indonesia and many of the Southeast Asian countries are very vulnerable because they can't grow wheat. The climate's not suitable. So they become import dependent.
Thank you very much for that, Elna. It's such an important and interesting case study. It takes us quite a way to looking at the complex determinants, particularly the political determinants there, and then global trade patterns. Thank you. Jason, I know that you work across architecture, planning, environment, human and planetary health. In terms of your work on architecture and planning and bringing this to planetary health, have we, and this isn't supposed to be a bleak question, honestly, but have we reached that stage where what we're doing is climate mitigation or climate adaptation? Or can we still improve planetary health through the choices that we make around the built environment?
I think the answer I would have is yes to the second question, which is I think there is still a need to improve mitigation and adaptation within the built environment to address particularly how our environment improves not only human health, but planetary health. And they're both totally interconnected, and we can't separate either of them. We only have one planet, and cities, which are our dominant built form, are actually now our dominant habitat. And those cities are one of the largest emitters. So how we build, design, and construct those cities actually can have a significant impact on the planet. So it's cyclical, the response, in a sense. What I would say is, I suppose where a lot of my work has focused is on built environment interventions for human and planetary health, but trying to integrate health into the climate change adaptation and mitigations that's occurring within the built environment to give a greater understanding of the benefit of these mitigations and adaptations. And I think what we have to remember is that human-generated climate change is caused by adverse direct impacts, sort of heat waves, which impact on our environment, and our built environments can very much mitigate and allow people to adapt, for example, to those sort of direct impacts like heat waves, for example, frequency of storms and intensities, which Sharon mentioned a minute ago. Lismore is a key example. And I think something we have to continue to remember is that where a person lives is very much determined by environmental justice principles, and people are located in different locations. So, for example, someone living in the east of Sydney has access to sea breezes, while someone in the west of Sydney doesn't, and the temperatures, when they escalate much higher. And so they have much more, the extremes are much more in certain locations. That's one example. And Lismore, the example which Sharon gave a minute ago, is a perfect example of where people are located in terms of zoning and those sort of things. What I would say is that it's really important for architects and planners and others. So whilst the health sector has a key role to play in addressing health effects, other professions like the built environments professions, like designers, architects, planners, can also continue to play a key role, and they need to, because the environment is the thing that mitigates how we are affected, and in the long term, how we emit and can decarbonize our environment. It's always important to think about in these professions, and there's increasing thinking in these professions about this, and increasing work between the health sector and the built environment sector on actually addressing these concerns. So, and a good example of that is, there's multiple ways we can both adapt our built environment. So as I said, an example of an adaptation is by increasing and greening and bluing our cities. We can reduce the heat impact on and insulate people from those impacts. So that's adaptation, but we don't want to stop there, because that's, if we continue to adapt, the problem just escalates. So what we want to simultaneously be doing with our built environments is mitigating as well, doing mitigating interventions. So a good example there, which most people can engage in, is integrated transport planning, for example. So we can develop our environment so it encourages people to do active transport, which has co-benefits for health. One, it helps us reduce our carbon footprint. Two, it gives people exercise, physical exercise. And then under both those headings of examples of adaptive interventions and mitigating interventions, there's multiple that can be applied to cities and to actually, and these are necessary because in the end, the health system, the planning or development system, the health system won't be able to cope with all the consequences of climate change alone. It needs the other systems, to build environment systems and other systems to be adapted to actually help us cope with the changes that are coming our way, and are already here, I would like to emphasize. So that's what I would say at this point. So I think it's a lot about how we slowly move towards, all these different professions move towards co-producing responses, not just independently.
Thank you very much, Jason. That was a really interesting and helpful overview of what's a complex and developing area. And there's some really nice, I think, global examples of where some of that is working very successfully, particularly around transport. I think greening transport, encouraging people to look at alternative travel that has those health benefits. Okay, so two public health experts, an architect and a lawyer, sit around a virtual table. So not the beginning of a dubious joke, but a reflection on the interdisciplinary nature of the problem that we're addressing. So the interdisciplinary nature of health inequities and of our concern. So recently, The Lancet argued that without effective action, health inequities are likely to become one of the defining social injustices of the 21st century. So it's a pressing problem, and understanding it and responding to it requires an interdisciplinary approach. And this is a question to each of you. What are the problems and the limitations of such an interdisciplinary project? So who's going to take my difficult question?
I can go first. I can suggest.
Jason.
I'll go with an example. Recently, I suppose coming back to the point I was just making a minute ago, there needs to be a lot more cross-sectoral leadership and integration, and to address these problems. No singular area or sector can address it independently, and that again is scaled up to a global context. It needs everyone to be playing in the field and addressing the issue for it to be addressed. A good example of that, but the challenges that we face in this area are that the challenges, as was said previously, are not equally, the impacts on our health are not equally distributed. So for example, recently in Sphere Sydney Partnership for Health Education Research and Enterprise, in the platform, there's many different projects that have been starting to focus on these areas. And one which I thought was an interesting reference in this case is one which was led by Fiona Haig, which was developing a climate change inequality health impact assessment for health services. And for example, what we need to do is we need to be looking at the relationship between particular environments, particular environmental contexts, populations, and health effects. And actually, we need to be working at locally, but thinking globally simultaneously. But we cannot address these challenges without actually having the appropriate tools. And I think things like health impact assessments, which are carried out by local health districts on climate impacts, is a valuable starting point for these sort of things. But we need the tools to do that and to address those challenges. I mean, if we look at something like local health districts just in New South Wales in Australia, they're all very diverse. Lismore is in one. Western Sydney has several local health districts, and they have various populations that really need to be understood and how they will be affected, and then have that impact assessed. So that's what I would say.
Michael, I'll go next. I think the international trade has shifted how local agriculture in many countries to the point where it weakens. Farmers can't compete with cheap imports, for example. So many countries have become import dependent, and you have powerful countries and corporations that really control international trade. And this is very particular for food, particularly for staples of all types of food. That really influenced the affordability, accessibility, availability of food. But what is really wicked about instant noodles is that it's so tasty, it's so cheap, and so accessible. And the flavors of the sachets have been modified to target the audience, the consumers. And that association, that cultural association with the food makes it really difficult for right to food, right to nutrition, right to health, from advocacy from that area, because it's very difficult to peel away from what people are associated with. And I think that's the area, I think, where instant noodles is highlighting the issue that the global food system is actually a determinant of health.
Thank you very much, Elna. Sharon.
Yeah, I've sort of a few takes on the question, Michael. So within to me, a kind of an interdisciplinary and then a kind of an intersectoral response, but an interdisciplinary response, and just sort of reflecting on many years of trying to do that type of work. So there's a hierarchy of disciplines. There's a hierarchy of evidence. There's a hierarchy of, actually, I'll just stick with those two hierarchies. And so that means that there's particular types of evidence from particular types of disciplines gets privileged in this discussion. And I've said publicly before, and I'll say it again, this is not an epidemiological problem to be solved by epidemiological data. This is a political problem to be solved by social science data. But even that remark is I think, insufficient. I think it's a combination of all of the above. But the privileging of certain types of knowledge into addressing this problem of climate change and health as the biggest 21st century challenge, that's one of the problems that I see of real interdisciplinary work. The intersectoral nature of it, so I'm sometimes torn between, imagine, Jason, you were speaking about, the planners or the lawyers. Imagine planners doing planning really well. And then there's the question of what does well mean? But planners doing planning really well would have all sorts of positive implications for health and the environment. But that's within the sector of planning. That, of course, doesn't happen all the time, and it certainly doesn't happen across other sectors. And the challenge, I think, is when the sectoral goals are so diametrically opposed. So we've done a lot of work on trade and health, and really the goals are, Elna, the work with the food systems and trade, and it's often so diametrically opposed that you don't get that comfort of knowing that if a sector does what it does really well, you'll get these positive benefits as well. So what is that? I don't entirely know what that means. And then the third thing that I would say is we've got to stop focusing on just the problem. But stop describing the problem, researching the problem, explaining the problem, and trying. It's what I would love is to see more, certainly within the academy, is understanding what it is that enables the change to happen. We know, that was, for decades, we've known these health inequities exist. We've known what drives these health inequities. Yes, we can get much finer resolution, absolutely, but we kind of know these drivers. Let's stop researching these drivers. Let's understand. My final remark is interdisciplinary work, I don't think is problematic. I think we just do it. I don't take the premise of the question, what's the problem or the challenges with it? It's just, let's just do it. In the same way doing any kind of sectoral work or disciplinary work, that's got strengths and weaknesses, challenges inherent to it as well. But yeah, I'll stop ranting.
That wasn't much of a rant, but thank you very much, and thank you everyone for those answers. And Sharon, I'm just going to stick with you for another question. So the Planetary Health Equity Hothouse has been up and running now for, I think, just over a year, perhaps.
Almost two.
Almost 2 years. And I know that you've brought together a really exciting and talented team, and that you've been very busy for this period. And this might be a slightly unfair question, given how long research can often take to reach conclusions, but I did want to ask you whether there have been any insights or findings so far that have surprised you or have stood out for a particular reason.
Yeah, I mean, it's been one of the most rewarding periods of my life, my professional life. It's been fantastic. And that's what I mean of, like the interdisciplinary research, because we are a team of political economists, of public health people, of global governance people, and a range of things in between. So it's really, just those everyday conversations are fantastic and incredibly difficult because we're all at the edge of our comfort zone all the time. But I think that's marvelous. I think that's really important. But what stood out? So we've had quite a bit of a focus on understanding the economic system or systems with that question of, and then how understanding the conditions that enable the change to happen there. But maybe just for people listening, like where there's this lovely connection between kind of economics and energy systems, really important, of course, for the global environment and human health and equities, are things like, have you heard of export credit agencies? I hadn't before this work. And if you're concerned about planetary health and planetary health equity, you should have, because export credit agencies are shaping the global finance market for investment in energy projects. So investment in fossil fuel projects or investment in renewable projects. And imagine if those decisions in export credit agencies, this is public finance, much bigger than any of the bank finance. Imagine if those decision processes recognised were inclusive of thinking about the social, environmental impacts. That would be great. So it really has taken us into these big structural, way far away from the healthcare system, and they really matter. Another area that I'd mention is the massive opportunity of the nationally determined contribution reports that every country that's part of the Paris Agreement is required to produce. And these NDCs, as they're short, the nationally determined contributions, is those targets that countries are working towards in terms of climate change mitigation, and also adaptation. These are the indications for national policy, mitigation and adaptation policies. And again, the opportunity for them to be inclusive of social and health goals, basically, our considerations. In Australia, they're not brilliant, they're mainly sort of economic focused. That's problematic. But the agency, the climate change agency, I've just did a blank, climate change agency, the CCA, which is the responsible agency for these that informs the government. It's a government agency. They're so open to considering what these NDCs the scope of these NDCs. So that's a big opportunity for those of us that might be interested in planetary health equity, to feeding into those spaces. That's that intersectoral, interdisciplinary project that we were saying was so hard, but it's just finding these perhaps unusual bedfellows or spaces to be engaging with. So that's been so for me, so illuminating and so rewarding in the work of the hothouse. That's just some examples.
Thank you very much for that, Sharon. That's really, really interesting. And I'm sure everyone is looking forward to hearing more from the hothouse as you continue through the next 3 years, I think it is. Yeah. So I have a final question before we hand over to the audience. And luckily enough, this seems to be the one that's getting upvoted most in our Q&A box. So please do have a look at that and add any questions you might have. So my question, and the question from the audience, luckily, so without absolving governments and corporations of their responsibilities, what are the steps that individuals can take to challenge these global systems that are causing planetary ill health? And that's a question, that's quite a large question to each of you. Jason, thank you very
I'm
much.
happy to go first. I suppose the first step is clearly acknowledging climate change and the inequalities it brings. The second one is, and quite often acting on these processes, because it is always quite often represented as a global challenge, can disable people because they think, well, what can I do as an individual? But I think, particularly if you go back to the original meaning that was put into, for example, the Rockefeller report, which was in the Lancet on planetary health, I think the emphasis which was clearly given there is the sort of the importance of acting locally and thinking globally. So, and many of the sort of things I've been talking about today and continue to talk about can actually be acted on in the built environment and the daily life. It's our daily life which generates the climate change effect. So any change there's many changes we can make in our daily life in itself, decisions. I think going back to the point, there is a certain system out there and siloing, which are very fixed in some ways, and they inhibit change towards addressing these issues, which will give us a better environment and better life. And I think we can actually chip away at that through acting in our own life, through how we use energy, how we use food, the waste, how we produce waste, all these, and how we consider these. But also everyone who is probably online is also a professional. So it's not only in their own life, but in their professional life, they can act. And also there is, and I agree with Sharon, disciplines can go so far. But if we talk about planning, for example, planning has a huge political element. So it's really important to actually put forward a strong voice and put forward strong arguments to act in these areas, because it's those voices which continue to make the change. So there are multiple ways I'd suggest that those changes can be made to the global system. And I think a lot of it starts at quite a small local level.
My recommendation is to make a difference through the dollar we spend. So reducing the consumption of ultra-processed food because it has such a broad reach. And also advocate for locally produced food, the diversity of food, so that we can always, those the food that are unique to a particular region continues to be alive and not become extinct. Yeah, and be more interested in food.
Thank you for that. And over to you, Sharon.
So I would say collective action is really important. I think the lessons from history show us that where important social change has happened, it's come through collective mobilization. I do worry when it becomes an individual responsibility to change the world. But the collective movement is really important, and that can be at any level. But I think as Jason was saying, that's a much easier thing to start at that more local level, and that can build up. I think also engage with your local representative. And I think now is a really important moment. We're seeing a window of opportunity for political representatives to be listening around these sorts of issues. So your local MP or whoever that is, talk to them. And then the third thing I would say is don't just talk to your friends, talk to the unusual bedfellows, they're not the usual suspects. And that's the building also around the coalitions. You're working with others who may not be the usual, but so that aligning of the food systems people with the planning systems people. There's a lovely synergy that can happen between those networks, and then that starts to demonstrate how that change can happen.
Thank you very much, everyone, for that. Yes, and I agree. It's important. I mean, we all have a role to play, but it's important not to privatize the entire responsibility for solving these problems. So it's a combination of the actions that we take individually, the consumption, as Elna says, about our food choices and our interest in food, but also the input that Sharon has just had in terms of the importance of politics and building alliances, further developing those spaces for collective action. Another question that's come up in the Q&A box is the question of how Australia's specific political system, so the state and federal structure, how does this either hinder or help us to respond to the climate crisis? So that, again, is a question to each of you.
I think here I'd like to put a positive note. I mean, there are certainly elements that are quite negative in politics, as there will always be, but I think I'll put a positive note here and say, for example, the Australian National Preventative Health Strategy now acknowledges the sort of impact on the environment and the relationship to people. There's strong evidence and acknowledgement in policy. Recently, the National Health and Climate Strategy emerged, and we have that. And then, for example, we now have the National Climate Risk Assessments out there, which is quite detailed. And I suppose what I would say, in a sense, there's a lot of momentum emerging in government at all levels. And I think it's an opportunity, as I said, whilst there will always be negative elements, there's an opportunity at the moment to draw on all these positive movements and these positive policies and directions to actually move forward.
Thank you very much, Jason. And we're moving into our last 1 or 2 minutes, probably our last minute. So can I ask our other panelists if they have quick responses to this? Elna.
My experience from interviews from the Australian wheat industry demonstrated that the state and federal government split was actually problematic. And it's the example that was provided was the poison that was required for the mice plague back in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic. And there was a lot of toing and froing, pushing the responsibility of where the poison can be imported from and how. So that was very problematic for the industry in terms of the structure of the government.
And can I just add, so I think there's that real possibility for policy learning and diffusion through those levels of government that we have. And then I think the trick is to be clear on where the policy and regulatory levers lie. There are some at the sort of Commonwealth level, and there's some at the state and territory level, and it's using those combinations of levers that are going to be really important. So I agree with Jason, there's some real possibilities, notwithstanding the challenges, but there's some real possibilities.
Thank you very much for that, Sharon. And thank you everyone for sort of managing to get us again to a positive point in what people can find quite a difficult conversation. So I've really appreciated that all the way through our discussions today. And it's been a really, really interesting discussion. So thank you to our panelists. And thank you very much to everyone who has joined us. We have a short survey that's now available in the chat, and it's just about the nature of the discussion that we've had today and how you found it. And we would really like to hear from you in response to that. But thank you again so much to our panelists, and thank you for joining us. And I hope that everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you.